In this episode, we discuss the relationship between objective truth and algebraic structure. Welcome to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. I'm Dr. Shannon Ray, and we're joined by our co-host, visual designer Oyani Onimiya. How you doing, Oyani?
I'm doing okay. I love how we start out this podcast in the same format all the time. Like you, for someone like me who loves
Consistency,
structure and routine and things like that, it brings joy to my soul. So I appreciate you always doing it the exact same way all the time.
Yeah, well, I changed it up a little bit. Actually, I started adding visual designer Oyani Onimiya.
Yeah, but at the same time, like we always say, you're still within the constraints of what we're trying to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
Perfect. Perfect way of putting it. Yep. Yeah, I don't know. I enjoy it. It's at this point. It's like I said, I can do it in my sleep.
I love it. I love it. Yeah.
Anyway, so this is our first time recording an episode after the New Year. So the first episode of 2022.
Yeah, it's first one for 2022. It's been a busy year, man. I'm working on so many things at once. And I'm also trying to launch a product with my brother.
Oh, for real?
Yeah, sometime next month.
Hopefully. No, I actually went to...
taking a lot of my time.
I saw your sister had a bunch of books, like actual physical books. I remember, I think I tried to buy them before, but they were only digital, and I couldn't find where to get them. But now she actually has hard copies.
She has physical books now. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna go to her website and buy a bunch of them.
Yeah, she's doing her thing, man. I'm so proud of her. Because this is something she's wanted to do for so long.
I was surprised how much it progressed. She actually has like little lights for the little night lights and stuff.
She's just doing her thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, that's what you got to do, man. Just keep at it. Chase the thing you want to do, and progress will come.
At first I was kind of surprised because I don't know. I really do appreciate people who have that entrepreneurial spirit and actually just go out and take risks and do things, because growing up, I'm trying to think if I knew too many people who owned their own businesses growing up. Yeah. And I don't think I knew too many, but I probably knew a few. But it seems like it's a rare thing. Like, it's not, every person doesn't own a business,
Not everyone can pull it off.
Huh?
Not everyone can pull it off.
Yeah, not everyone can pull it off. Not everyone takes the risk. That's the whole point. A lot of people don't even take the first steps to do it because, you have to have this belief and trust in yourself to actually think you can pull it off. And so I feel like within her world, your sister's world, because she already started a business, that this whole Brave Chris thing, the thing she's doing,
this is like just regular life.
This is probably
for sure. Like, sometimes when I have conversations with her, it's like talking to someone who lives in a whole different capitalist type reality to us. Like, we just open a new factory over here, and that's how we do it. It's just normal life for her at this point. So.
It blows my mind because, like, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and I was talking about the people on Shark Tank, because Eunice and I love watching that show. And you look at these people, and they're running these businesses, like they're just handling millions of dollars of, a transaction with $1 million is just basic life nothing to them. And for them, that's a Tuesday, And for them, like, so many people's livelihoods depends on them not messing it up.
Yep.
And I could only imagine, like, if you haven't had that lived experience of starting from nothing and then going up to where you're at that point, and you were just dropped off at that point where it's like, here, now you have to handle millions of dollars. If you mess it up, these people will lose their jobs and all this stuff. That type of pressure would just be crushing, but it's just fascinating when
we see it all the time. People who come into a huge sum of money and they just, go off the deep end eventually, or in a short time. Yeah, we see it all the time. It takes a certain level of skill to be able to navigate what I would call a sandbox style of living, like almost like an open world game is what you're playing, to where there is no structure. You make the structure.
Yes.
And you have to consistently double check that structure is corresponds to reality. Because if you keep, it's, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Honestly, I don't know if I said this in the podcast before, but I thought of it in the perspective of being in the wilderness versus being like on a track. Yeah. So for me, my progress to where I am, I just chose the simplest route, which was we have institutions that say, take this class, pass the class. take
this
class,
next class,
pass the class,
and then get this.
Yeah, and then get this. There's no wilderness. I know the constraints of the space. I don't have to create them myself. They're already made, and I just have to get over the bar. But then there's other people who do stuff like this entrepreneurial work, and it could just be someone literally in their house one day thinking, you know what, I want to change my life. I'm going to start a business. And now suddenly they're in the wilderness where there's no one telling them how to do it. There's no one telling them you do this and then you pass this. They just have to figure it out. They have to create the space and they have to adjust their model of the space as they go. So like you said, that they can follow the constraints and be successful in that space. And it's like a sandbox. And that level of freedom, I don't think a lot of people can really handle that.
Nah, it's a lot, man. And that's kind of why when I hear people online say stuff like, a lot of people preach this entrepreneurial lifestyle, be your own boss, quit your job, whatever. It's not for everybody.
No.
And, it doesn't mean you're better if you start a business than someone who works at a regular company, does a 9 to 5. Like, there's no better. It's just based off of what you have the capability to handle. Some people have the capability to handle the sandbox open world experience. Some people just want to play the story mode and get it over with.
Yeah. Matter of fact, I was listening to the recent Joe Rogan podcast with Jordan Peterson, which, I love Jordan Peterson. I think the dude's brilliant. And he was talking about the idea of playing a game to Joe. And he said, all right, let's play a game. Make the first move. And he didn't give any constraints about what game it was. It was just make the first move. And it's like, and then Joe didn't do anything. He just sat there. And his point was like, when you have absolute freedom, like I think his argument that he was making is that there is freedom in having constraints.
Oh,
because
absolutely.
if you're playing chess, and I think that's what the example you use, like once you know you're playing chess, now you have the freedom to be creative in that space to be like, all right, I'm going to move this pawn 2 squares as my first move, And there's that level of parallelization, like we become paralyzed when you have too much freedom. Too much freedom is like being dropped in the wilderness and just saying, all right, figure out meaning, figure out, what you should be doing, figure out what to value, figure out what decisions you should be making. You have to figure all that out on your own.
And you have to have a good grasp on reality to even be successful in a space like that. You have to have a legit grasp on what's going on in your life, your capabilities, your abilities. Like, you can't bullshit your way through the wilderness.
No.
Yeah.
I love that. You can't bullshit your way through the wilderness.
There was something I read a few years ago, and it always comes to mind when I think about this. It says, creativity thrives best when there are constraints.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I'm almost at my most creative self when I have a constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, I get a project that is, creative branding for kids cereal.
Yeah.
The constraints are clearly there.
Yep.
So I prefer to, I feel like I am more creative when I have those type of constraints as opposed to, just create a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Versus create this thing for this purpose. Now you know the constraint. You're constrained by the colors you can use. You're constrained by the fonts you can use. The sizing constraints, like all that shit now has to take
the outcome. The outcome of the game. Like you're trying to program a specific outcome. And that's the thing is, for people who listen to this podcast, what we're saying will just sound like, oh, we're just treading, old stuff. But it really, I think people really need to put into perspective the difficulty in creating consistent structure.
Yeah.
And so if you're in this sandbox world of, oh, I'm going to start a business now, that's it. Just start a business. You don't know which business you're going to start. You don't know which one would be the most profitable. You don't know how to even start keeping track of your finances. You're not knowing how to structure your like what information to keep track of.
Something even as basic as what you can do legally or what you can't do.
Yeah, what you can do legally. All that stuff is all the freedom that you didn't have to navigate. And so when you start this process of starting a business, you're going to try a few things, you're going to fail, and then you're going to start adjusting. Okay, when this happens, then that happens, and I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to make a rule, I'm going to make a constraint that says don't do this. Yeah. And through that process, you start building these constraints, you start constructing the space that you're navigating in. And for these spaces to have any sort of meaning, basically you have to think of I'm going to start a business. And then there's all of these symbols and things that you can do. And then to actually construct a space after that, out of that, you have to then start creating a relationship between all the symbols. And it's that process of creating the relationship or the syntax of that space. When with this input, I get this output, and with this input, I get this output, and these inputs and outputs are related to each other. It's through that where you create the structure. And so the structure is you have a set of symbols, and then you have a set of rules for how these symbols interact with each other.
Yep.
And so, as we were saying, and the best way to look at this is just in terms of language. So, in pointing in the continuum, the whole point to that episode is we were trying to basically explain how, I'm pointing over here, I'm not pointing over there. I'm pointing at pirate, I'm not pointing at Smurfs. And so, basically what I'm trying to say is that for a language to produce meaning, it has to have a consistent set of rules for taking in symbols of that language and then outputting new symbols. And my argument is that set of rules is an algebraic structure. So if you look on the Wikipedia page of something called an algebraic structure, it says that an algebraic structure consists of a non-empty set A, a collection of operations on A, and a finite set of identities known as axioms that the operations must satisfy. And so to understand what that means, we can break it down in terms of language. So in this case, the set A is the set of symbols. So you have a language and it has a set of symbols. The symbols could be like mom, brother, whatever symbols you have in that language, you have a set of symbols. And then you have a collection of operations. And so that collection of operations is like taking in a bunch of symbols. So like I construct a sentence, for example, that would be like the operations on these symbols. Like how do I create meaning? And so these operations, they have a finite set of identities or axioms that they have to follow. And these identities make sure that you're always mapping into the same space. So I create a sentence, I'm trying to communicate something, and then it points at, pirates and not at Smurfs. Because those collection of operations is like the syntax. It is going to an English class and them teaching you what a sentence is, how punctuation works. Those are your operations, and then you input symbols into the operation. So you use words to construct sentences, which creates meaning, which maps to a concept. And so this is essentially what an algebraic structure is. And if you're going through and you're trying to construct a space to navigate, you need a set of rules that consistently map to one thing versus something else.
Yeah. And I definitely, I agree 100% what you're saying. Something that's always stuck with me, is, someone said language enables us to spend less time talking and more time doing.
Oh, interesting.
And when I read that, I kind of applied it to the design world. So in design, we say, in my head, when I'm making something, when I'm designing a logo or a brand for someone, I'm thinking in my head is, I want to design something that will cause people to spend less time thinking, but more for them to do something. I want them to do an action as opposed to more time thinking. So if you create an interaction dialogue screen that pops up on your website, for example, you don't want people to spend too much time thinking about what option to take on.
Yes.
You want them to just go in there and understand the language so plainly and just make the right decision that they want to make. And that's the essence of language as far as how it pertains to design, and how someone like me makes sure that when I'm communicating, I treat it like words. I use my colors, I use my shapes, I use my illustrations and as words, the same way you use words, because I'm trying to communicate something. Yeah. And it has to like tie into, I guess, the language.
If it is the case that I took a symbol and every time I use it, it maps to something completely different. And so the best example is, imagine a world in which every single word in a language the meaning of that word is specific to each individual and how they feel about that word.
Yeah.
So if I say take the word book, the symbol book, BOOK, and imagine that every time you go to use that symbol, someone else like, oh, well, I feel book is actually more corresponds to the feeling I have when I stub my toe. So if you're talking about some sort of paper thing with words in it with like stories and stuff in it, that's not what I think of. I think of stubbing my toe. So
imagine a world where someone is on the side of the street in an accident and someone says, someone call 911. We all know what that means.
Yes,
now imagine
exactly.
a world where say someone call 911, someone calls a pizza company. Someone call 911, someone calls a car rental. It's like, no. No one wants to live there.
And you have no consistency as to what that word will point to.
Yes.
That is a space in which there is no algebraic structure. And this is actually an important feature of algebraic structures is a one-to-one correspondence. So if I were to take the word book, or I would take a sentence containing the word book or something like that, I want those words to have meaning independent of any individual. And so what that means is that whenever you use the word fire, for example, you don't want it to mean the exact opposite of fire.
Yeah.
Because if when I go to use that word, one person imagines it as the exact opposite of fire, and every single time I use it, it means something different to every single person, then there isn't a one-to-one correspondence. This thing maps to everything evenly. Yeah. If it maps chaos. To everything evenly, then it's pure chaos. It has no predictive power. It is a symbol with no meaning. And what that means is that you can't understand the meaning of symbols based off its relationships with other things, because you have to think of the sentence. Think of the sentence as the story. So the sentence is like a story where you take the sentence, it's the operation, it takes in a bunch of inputs, and then it maps to an output. And so the process of that sentence taking in symbols and mapping it to another output, to the output, that's the inputs going to the outputs is the relationship between the input and the outputs. And then the sentence is the algebraic structure that creates relationships between the inputs and the outputs. And if every single time a sentence maps to a completely different output every single time you used it, then it maps to nothing. Because it maps to everything equally and it creates no meaning. And so if you're trying to create any sort of objective meaning, you need two things. First, you need an algebraic structure that has a consistent set of rules that creates relationships between concepts. Yeah. If you don't have a structure that follows a consistent set of rules that creates meaning between concepts, then you can't model anything. And so one of the examples I was trying to think is like when you're trying to understand what objective truth is, like whether or not something's objective true, you have to think of it like we're saying back and pointing in the continuum, is that whenever you go into a situation and you take in some data, so you walk into a room and there's a fire in the corner. You've walked into a room, you made a measurement, you got the data that there is something on fire in the corner, and then your language, the structure you have in your system automatically points somewhere. Danger, problem, fire, burning, and it points to those things. Objectively, it's not pointing to, oh, now it's time to take a nap. It's not pointing to, oh, it's time to break dance. It's not. That's not where the data points. The data points to this danger fire thing.
Oh, so what I'm understanding about, I guess what I understand about language, as far as, because I try to interpret things from a more creative design standpoint sometimes when we have these conversations. Yeah. And I can't for the life of me imagine, anyone who's trying to be a designer or, be good at designing stuff or creating anything and not understanding the concept of language and the idea that what you're trying to do by creating this art or this, branding, this website, whatever it is you're trying to communicate. Mm-hmm. And so you have to approach everything you're doing as language.
Yeah, and which is the same thing as you're trying to program, because to communicate is to means I'm trying to take someone from this configuration to a configuration where they understand what I'm trying to communicate.
And more often than not, as a designer, you're trying to get people to take a certain action.
It's a matter of, does the data point in this direction? Like, like I was saying, there's a fire, you gathered some data, and that's going to point, it's going to produce an interpretation which points to a concept or ideas in your mind. And so your language determines where it points. And if it is the case that your language has no structure, so that when you walk into a room and you see a fire, you think every single time you walk into a room and you see the same fire, you think something completely different. Like the language in your mind maps to something completely different every time you see the exact same image, then that language has no capacity whatsoever to model anything or to create truth, because it has no structure.
It has no meaning.
It has no meaning. Every input can map to anything else with no consistency whatsoever. And if that's how it works, if that's how your language works, then it has no capacity to create any meaning, which means that it has no capacity to create objective truth. And so a requirement for objective truth is a logically sound, consistent language, a logically sound, consistent set of metaphors, so that when you take in an input, it reliably maps to a specific output, and the relationships between all of the symbols in your space have some sort of consistent structure. And if you don't have that, then you cannot model anything and you cannot create truth, because your language just makes random noise.
Mm-hmm.
You see? And so I think that is the issue, where language lies in the process of creating objective truth. And then once your language produces an interpretation of some data, you walk into a room, you see someone on the ground with a bullet hole in their chest, and your mind is going to map to a bunch of concepts. There's a body on the ground. Your language is creating a model. It's rendering a model of the thing you're looking at. Mm-hmm. And so then you have to say, is that model an accurate representation of the thing I'm looking at? You ask that question. It's like, all right, my language has produced a model, and now I want to know whether or not that model is consistent with the actual state of the universe, with the configuration of the degree of freedom soup. And so to verify that your model is accurate, you start trying to make predictions with it about the thing. And so that's the scientific process. And so these are the two processes to make truth. First, you need a language that has consistent structure so that it can produce meaning. Then, once it's produced meaning, it's created a model of the thing you're looking at. Then you start using the scientific method and start trying to make predictions about the thing you're looking at based on the model that your language produced. And you do those two things and you can create objective truth.
Yeah. And I think it makes perfect sense, because I can imagine a world where you were invited to a birthday party at a location or whatever, and you get to the location, you open up the door, and you see a coffin with someone laying in there. You know you're in the wrong place.
Yeah.
You know that this is not the birthday party I was going to. Now,
or it is the birthday party that you're going to, and you've been lured into a trap.
Yeah.
Something has gone awry for sure.
Something has gone awry. Exactly. At the very least, okay, something has gone not quite the way I want, because we already have this consistent set of rules and symbols and all of these things that we've created over these years. So you walk into that room, you're modeling something differently.
Yes,
than what you were expecting when you were coming there.
Yes, exactly. So that's a perfect example. So someone comes up to you and they invite you to a party. It is a family member. It's people they're telling you that there's going to be balloons. There's going to be there's going to be festivities. There'll be children.
They don't even need to tell you all that.
But imagine that they told you all those things. So every single thing that they include in there keeps pointing to a specific thing. All right, in my head, the data they're giving me is creating a model in my head of what I expect to see when I walk into this room.
Balloons, music.
Yes, and so then you go to the location that you're told to go to. You open the door and you see a coffin and some cobwebs, and you're like, "What the hell? This is not consistent with the model that I had in my head. And so it's like that data that they gave you was not true data. It wasn't objectively true, because when I tried to make a prediction about what I expect to see when I opened the door using that data, it didn't work. So the data is objectively false. It's not true. And the only way that's possible is if whenever they were handing you the language of party and what's going to happen there, you needed an algebraic structure to produce to actually produce an image, a model of the data that they're handing you.
Yeah. So I can't imagine like this person who was handing you this data in the first place. Balloons mean something different to them. Balloons. Yes. The word balloon means cobweb to this person.
Exactly.
It means pitchfork.
Yes.
And it's like, oh yeah, there'll be balloons, there'll be cake, and you're like, oh sure. And then you show up there, you see cobwebs, you see a pitchfork, you see a coffin. Yeah, something has gone awry, like we said.
And then you go up and you confront that person, like, yeah, everything I said was going to be there, was in there, because they had a completely different structure.
Chaos.
And this is the sense in which it's objective data, because it's objective in the sense that when I speak English, I don't make up the rules of English. There is a standard. And then that standard is encoded in every single person who speaks English. That standard is encoded. So the standards, the symbols, the operations that produce meaning, the structure, the syntax, all of that stuff is independent of any individual. And so the images it creates are objective because they don't depend on what each individual believes. Like, everyone doesn't have their own rules for producing meaning in English. There are a set of standard rules for producing meaning in English. And those rules are independent of any individual, which means they are objective.
Yep.
So this is where objective truth comes from.
And we hear this cliche statement all the time. Words mean things. Words do mean things. Mm-hmm. And the weight of that is something that we should just respect. Yeah. Because it guides how we communicate, how we program people, how we program the universe, how we are programmed by the universe in turn. Words mean things. Yeah. And so, go ahead.
No, it's just funny because you just said this. What you're saying created two forks of things that I like, 2 points that I want to bring up.
Go ahead.
So one of the points was that going back to objective truth, as we were talking about it and pointing in the continuum. This is what we're trying to communicate in pointing in the continuum, is that these words with their meanings, like the party example, they point to a specific location in your mind in the space of words, in the space of concepts. But there's always this degree to which they don't point absolutely. So even if someone has communicated a message to you, there's always this possibility of misinterpreting it. So that's number one. Okay. But number two, did I lose it? So what were you saying? Can you say the point you were saying again?
I don't even remember.
Yeah. Damn. Because you were talking about, what were you talking about?
Words mean things is what I was saying.
Words mean things. Yeah. Shit, I lost it. Damn. Never mind. I just derailed an entire train of thought.
I know. But I think it's interesting. Language has been something that really fascinates me, especially, and I feel like the topic of language, we've been talking about this for a very long time, and how much people tend to not really think about the weight of what it means as it guides us as a society or as we move as a group, and how we can actually rely on, these set of rules and symbols that we have created in the English language, for example, to kind of provide meaning to our lives, to help us like unpack information when we're handed when it's handed to us. Yeah. And so when you hear someone say stuff like, word mean things or whatever, it's easy to just dismiss it as another popular cliche. But like the example we gave, when someone says there will be cake at this party, there's a set of things that satisfy what the word cake means.
Yes, exactly.
Cupcake, ice cream cake, you can even be a jerk and go down to urinal cake if you want.
Yeah.
But
exactly,
it's not a coffin.
Yes. Yeah. And this goes down. I guess we can go that one thread that I was going along, which was the uncertainty, that it doesn't point somewhere absolutely. Like you just gave the example, it could be urinal cake, it could be ice cream cake, it could be all these things. And this is the degree to which there is ignorance or there's entropy. And so in this paper that we're still waiting to hear back from the referees, but I submitted for publication, it's called Canonical Quantum Coarse-Graining and Surfaces of Ignorance. And so that example that you used with the urinal cake and ice cream cake, that would represent the surface of ignorance. And the thing about my paper is I'm dealing with quantum states. And so instead of there being a discrete set of things like urinal cake or the cereal example where you go through and look at all the cereals, what I use are these algebraic structures called Lie groups. And so Lie group is a specific algebraic structure that is a continuum. So as we were saying, we're pointing into continuum, Lie groups have a continuum structure to them.
Okay.
And so what they do is that when I have a quantum state, like when we call these quantum states density operators, these things have some information in them, the information contained in the density operator. And so whenever you have a density operator, you can compute the amount of information that's inside of these things. And we have these things called quantum information entropy, like the von Neumann entropy or the Rengge entropy. We have these different entropies to say, okay, this quantum state right here, it has this much information in it. It's missing this much information, but it has this much information. And so with the missing information, that is equivalent to, is there going to be a urinal cake there or is there going to be ice cream cake? There isn't any information to say whether it's one or the other. They just said cake. And so instead of it being like, look at all the set of cakes, what we do is we take the quantum state, we look and say, okay, this thing is missing this much information. We then take the Lie group and we use the Lie group to generate all the possibilities. So it'd be like if the Lie group is producing all the different ways to interpret cake. And there's a continuum of all the different ways you can interpret cake. And so in the paper that I'm working on, the reason why they're called surfaces of ignorance is they're exactly that. Someone says there's going to be cake. I don't know which cake is going to be there, but I can use the Lie group to generate all of the different ways to interpret cake. Okay. And then from that Lie group, I construct this thing. Like I actually use something called the first fundamental form, which you may remember from configuration stability principle where I brought that up. But in differential geometry, to construct a metric of a geometry, you use the thing called a first fundamental form. So don't let it confuse you. The only thing that you have to imagine is that I have this Lie group and I can associate a geometry, like I can construct a basketball out of it. So it's like, and every point on the basketball is a different interpretation of cake. I have that. All I know is I have cake, and that constraint creates a space, which is the basketball. And every point on that basketball is a valid interpretation of cake because it satisfies the constraints of cake. And so basically, I have this geometry that I've constructed, and depending on how much ignorance there is, i.e., depending on how much missing information there is, the size of the basketball changes. So the more missing information, the larger the basketball. The less missing information, the smaller the basketball. And so when I compute the size of the basketball, I'm essentially computing its volume. So I can compute a volume of the basketball, and that volume directly corresponds to the amount of information missing from the quantum state. And so, so in the paper itself, one of the claims that we make, and one of the things that we demonstrate, is that if you take the von Neumann entropy, which is a standard measure for computing entropy for quantum states, like the amount of information in the state, and then I compare the amount of information missing in the state to the volume of the surface of ignorance, I get a one-to-one correspondence. So in other words, if I take a density operator and I say this thing has no information, it's all entropy, it's all uncertainty, that thing has the largest volume. And then as I transition from quantum states with no information, maximum uncertainty, to states where there's more information, it's like, okay, I changed the quantum state a little bit so that there's a little more information. And then I compute that volume. Well, that volume is a little smaller. Then I add a little more information, and then the volume gets smaller. And there's a one-to-one correspondence between the amount of information that's computed by the von Neumann entropy and the volume of my surface of ignorance. And that's what we're doing in the paper, is that we are literally constructing ignorance based off a lack of information. That's literally what it is. Yeah.
Pretty interesting. Because I'm wondering, like, in the example we talked about with cake, so the more information I provide to this person about the kind of cake that's going to be there, it starts to, like, reduce the size of the basketball, because things that don't fall into, if I say there's going to be cake there and the cake is going to be sweet, obviously urinal cake is out of there.
Yep. It's edible.
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know how urinal cake tastes, but I'm hoping it's not sweet, guys. But
they might be delicious. You never know.
I don't know. But I guess that's what you're trying to say, to where, you the more information that's in there, the more the surface of ignorance reduces.
Yes, the smaller it is. Yes, exactly it is. And this is, if you guys remember from the second episode, or maybe, I think it was the second episode of the first season, and I said that I did some calculations and I had a prediction about what should happen, and then I did the math and it came out correctly. That's exactly what I was talking about. I literally came up with this idea of a surface of ignorance and was like, well, if this is true, then as I increase the amount of information in the quantum state, the volume of this thing should decrease. And we call this a monotonic decrease, because it never increases and then decreases. It's not like I start off with a quantum state with no information, and then I start adding information, and then you look at the volume as I add more information, and it goes up sometimes and goes down. No, it always just decreases. And the reason why I came up with that calculation in the first place is because I was trying to understand Lie groups. Like, that calculation was literally me conceptualizing, how do I verify my understanding of Lie groups? Because if my understanding is correct, then I should be able to make a prediction about the volume of the thing. And since I have a background in general relativity, I know how to construct a metric. So I was like, oh, well, this is a continuum. So I can construct a metric, which means I can compute the volume, which means that this volume better decrease as there's more information. And the whole point is that when you use the Lie group to generate all the things that are consistent with the word cake, when you use the Lie group to generate that, what that means is all those different interpretations of cake that are consistent with the word cake, we call that gauge. So one of the things that I said was that I think gauge is a consequence of significant figures. And what I mean by that is significant figures, they tell you how much information you're providing. So if I say that a stick is 4.5 centimeters long, then I've given you 2 significant figures. If I say it's 4.53, then I've given you 3. If I say 4.532, the more digits I give, the more information I give, the less ignorance there is. And that was my literal thinking when I was trying to understand how the Lie groups work, without thinking to myself that, okay, I'm trying to point in a continuum. I give some constraint data. The more data I give, the smaller the volume, the less data I give, the bigger the volume, and then let me do a calculation to prove that that's true. And yeah.
And how does this kind of relate to our everyday life? I feel like we're gonna talk about that.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Tell me how does this relate to just our day-to-day living as far as gauge and all that.
Okay. So I want to juxtapose 2 examples to make this clear. The first example is, imagine you're a carpenter, and your foreman or your boss is like, I want you to cut a piece of wood so that it is 25.35 centimeters long, 25.35. And then imagine that the carpenter comes back to the boss, and he's like, okay, I've cut this thing so that it's 25.3542, or do you want me to cut it to 25.3567? And the foreman's like, I don't give a fuck. As long as it's 25.35, I don't care how many digits there are beyond that. Yeah. The schematics of the thing we're trying to build says it needs to be 25.35. So I don't care if it's 25.3544 or, so when that person's cutting it, imagine he's like, all right, well, I'm going to go with 25.3562. his ability to pick 6'2" is his gauge freedom, because the system doesn't require that level of precision. Like, no one cares beyond that, so he has complete freedom to choose whichever one he wants.
That constraint of 25.5.35.
Yeah. And so what that means is that the constraint data of 25.35 gives this freedom for him to choose anything beyond that, because it's all consistent with the constraint data. And what we've been saying this entire time is the constraint data, 25.35, that's like the macro state. And then the 25.3523 is like a micro state. And so how that relates to the second example is, you and I, we're both black. This is an example that I think will be very clear. Imagine that we're walking down the street, and I'm a person who tends to, when I walk past strangers, to smile and nod at them. Just like, hey, I'm a human, you're a human. Hey, hello. I acknowledge you. And I do this to almost everybody. And sometimes some people will just smile and nod back. They'll just give like a slight nod. But sometimes people just frown. They kind of look at you funny. They don't respond in a friendly way. And I could go through the world and, like, say I nod my head to a white person, and they respond by kind of looking at me strange or mean mugging or whatever it is.
Or just ignoring you, basically.
Or just ignoring me. It could be any of those things. Now, the thing is I now have to interpret that situation. And so the constraint data is I nodded this to a white person. They did not nod back to me in the same way. And that's the constraint data. Now, I have a freedom to interpret that.
To interpret the person not responding.
Huh?
You have the freedom to interpret the person's non-response.
Yes, I have a freedom to interpret the situation of what just happened. So
the situation.
Yeah, so I have a freedom to interpret the situation, and I could immediately go to, this person's racist. This person did not smile at me because they're racist. But the thing is it could be a million things. It could be because they're having a bad day. It could be because I caught them off guard. They could be thinking about something intently, and they just weren't, you know what I mean? There are an infinite, a continuum, literally, of things you can imagine why this person didn't smile at you. And I know from my own personal experience that sometimes if I'm having a particularly bad day or I'm thinking about something deeply and someone smiles at me, I may look back at them in a mean way. And then after I walked off, I'm like, man, I really wish I hadn't done that. But it's like, it's too late now. But I have to be willing to give someone else the same grace if if I walk past them and they don't, like, nod back to me. And so this whole point is that all of the different ways of interpreting this thing, that's your gauge freedom. That's your freedom to interpret. And for me personally, the objective state of reality is the surface of ignorance. You do not have more data to narrow it down to any of the possibilities. The objective state of reality is the surfaces of ignorance. That's the reality you live in. That's where your mind should be pointing to. But if you go to yourself and go, nope, it's definitely the case that this person did this because they're racist, then you are fixing the gauge. This is what it's called, fixing the gauge. You're taking a particular microstate, which is an interpretation of the situation that is consistent with the macro data. You're taking a particular one of them and you're saying that that's definitely what it is.
And you're elevating it above all the other ones.
Yes. And what that does, though, is if it is the case that reality is actually the surface of ignorance, then what you have to do is you have to treat all possibilities as equally likely. Because as we've been trying to say...
Until you get more data.
Until you get more data. Exactly. You have to treat them equally likely. To do anything else is essentially to lie to yourself about the state of reality. But the problem is that if you fix gauge and you think it's racist, it's going to affect your day. It's going to affect how you feel. It's going to affect your perspective. It's going to affect how you interact with. It's going to affect your spirit. Like, depending on how you fix gauge, it's going to affect your spirit and how you move through the world.
I laughed about this because the other day I woke up and I realized I didn't have any coffee.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh man. So I rushed to the grocery store, and typically I'll sleep with my, I have this flamboyant, flowery looking hat I wear to sleep.
Yep.
So I was like, you know what? I just need coffee. Hopped in my car. I forgot it was on my head, and I just drove to the store. And I get to the store, as you always do, you want coffee and you end up picking all kinds of things. So I'm walking around the store picking all kinds of things, and I noticed like 3 or 4 different women, they like looked at me.
Yeah.
Like longer than normal. In my head, I interpret like, I guess women are feeling me today. That was kind of how I interpreted it. I didn't really think too much about it. So I'm just walking around feeling good with myself, whatever. And then I get to my car, I'm about to go in, and then I see my reflection, and I see the hat on my head, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. That's why they were staring at me. And to me, that's how I see Gage. It's like, I could have just run off with that interpreting like, oh man, I am just the best looking. No, they were staring at me because I had this flamboyant looking hat on.
Yeah. And if people don't know that both of us have really long dreadlocks, so that's why. It's funny because you mentioned that, and the way I sleep, I don't wear the hat like you, but when I sleep, I take my hair and I tie it so that it's all on top of my head. So that I can lay my head back, right? But sometimes that's my going to sleep hairstyle, and I'll wake up sometimes and I go to take out the trash or walk outside, like, oh shit, my hair is still ridiculous looking. Yeah,
and but so it's just an interesting way to understand Gage, like you were explaining, and how it really does impact how you see the world and just how your reality is modeled.
And this was literally like me trying to I was like, oh shit, I think Gage is just a consequence of a lack of information. I think that's what it is. And like we've been saying the entire podcast is that, if I have a set of possible outcomes, so say I have 3 possible outcomes, if I weigh them 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, that distribution of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, that has maximum uncertainty and zero information. Like people would need to really like absorb these words. A maximally mixed distribution, which is what that is, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, has zero information. Zero. And so what that means is that when I construct a surface of ignorance, which is all the ways to interpret the constraint data, like the cake examples, like all the things that they could be referring to when they're talking about cake, the reason why you can do this, because it's like, okay, I have this constraint data, but somehow I've constructed this surface of ignorance thing, and that seems to have more information in it. But the reason why it doesn't have more information is because you're treating every single point on that thing as being equally likely. Like I was saying with the racism thing, where I think it's racism. Like, no, because if you can identify how much information there is, you have to weigh them all evenly. Because if you don't weigh them evenly, then you're not using a maximally mixed distribution, and you're saying that one is more likely than the other, which means that you're saying that there is more information to distinguish one from the other. But that's the whole point to the surface of ignorance. It's telling you how much information there is. This is all of it. So you cannot you cannot say it's one thing versus another. You have to treat them all equally. To not do that is to not live in objective reality. This is the objective state of things. Yeah. This is the amount of information, and this and from that, these are the set of things that you could interpret from there.
Yeah, and I think this is so important with right now, as we absorb news articles and read things online, and hear this story here. Sometimes it's easy to interpret a situation with just a limited amount of data.
Yeah.
To where you end up making up information that's not there.
You make it up. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that a lot of times the reason why that happens is if you have an emotional investment in a particular interpretation, you might be giving things more weight just because it suits your preconceptions. It suits how you want to see reality as opposed to what reality actually is. And so this process of fixing the gauge, the thing is you're not, it can feel right because you're not totally wrong, because that is an interpretation that is consistent. It is a possibility that it is consistent with the constraint data. So, and the thing is about living is that sometimes all you have is the constraint data. You don't have more information. And if you don't, sometimes you still need to make a decision. So you have to go through and be like, okay, well, this is all the information I have, but I have to say one is more likely than the other to make a decision, because you're never going to have full information. So at some point in time, you have to fix the gauge. And so, this is just a standard problem of existing. But, I think that, like one thing that I wanted to mention, this concept of not fixing the gauge and keeping it open. We call that the principle of insufficient reason. Because in the principle of insufficient reason, you're assuming you can't assume there's more information than there is. And actually, there's a quote from this famous or this foundational person from statistical mechanics named James, this researcher, and I quoted him in the paper, and I just want to read that quote because I really like it. Go ahead. See if I can find it real quick. So in the paper, I say, to place anything other than a maximally mixed distribution on the set of purifications, in our case, in my paper, purifications are the microstates. They are the things that are consistent with the data. On the set of purifications, as stated by James, amount to arbitrary assumption of information which by hypothesis we do not have. So that's why you have to put you have to treat all of them as equally likely, because to do anything else violates the principle of insufficient reason, because to do that would be to assume that there's an arbitrary amount of information by hypothesis we're saying we don't have. Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, if the information is not there, it's not there. You can't make it up.
Yes, exactly.
You can't make it up. Yeah. So if this person who you said hi to, and this person completely ignores you, and you decide, you know what, I'm just going to treat it as a maximally mixed state and just go about my day. Maybe the next time you say hi to this person, they respond the same way. Now you're gathering more data. The surface is getting smaller and smaller until you come to the point, this person does not say hi to black people.
Exactly. And this is what I always try to say to people is like, and I've said this, I've had these conversations before, is that, you interact with somebody and it's your first interaction and they give it a first impression. And say that you think, man, that sounded a little racist. That might have been racist. You know what I mean? But if you give this person the benefit of doubt, you're like, okay, they might have been racist, but there's a lot of other things. I'm going to keep it as, it could be all these things. And then you interact with them again, and it's like, all right, that's a little more. And then you interact with them more. It's like, no. After interacting with them 50 times, or 10 times, or however many times it takes, I've gathered enough data to be certain that this person's racist. Yep. And trying to figure out how much data you need to gather, at what resolution do I need at what resolution do I need to resolve this thing before I can draw a conclusion? How many interactions exactly do I need to have with this person before I can say, they're racist? And this is a question of resolution, and this is the process of coarse-graining. Coarse-graining is the whole point, is that you have a model of something, and you go from a high-resolution model to a low-resolution model. And the reason why you do this is because you are a computational being with a finite amount of computational resource. And so one of the games that you have to be playing all the time is, at what resolution do I need to model this thing so that I can solve the problem that I'm trying to solve, so I can win the game?
Like, what resolution do I need to look at it to see it?
Yes. At what resolution do I need to look at it to see it? Like, exactly. That's exactly it. And to go back to pointing the continuum to kind of get this idea of resolution, it's like what you said before. It's like zooming out. Yeah. So in the example that we're using, you can think of Oyani. All right. So Oyani has all these archetypal traits that when you put them all together, they make a unique individual, Oyani Onimiya. But one of those traits are Nigerian artist. So imagine that you want to understand something about Nigerian artists. Like, say you're an anthropology student and you're like, I want to learn about Nigerian artists, what their interests are, what type of art they do, how successful they are. Like, I want to gather information about Nigerian artists. And so if that's the case, you want to know something about the lower resolution data, which is Nigerian artists. And so you're zooming out. Like, you're not particularly interested in Oyani Onimiya individually. You're interested in only this data. And so this process of trying to build a model of the spirit of Nigerian artists, like, you have to, there's like a whole process to this. And I don't want to keep talking because I kind of want to explain that, but I don't know if you want to say something before I do that.
No, because I'm thinking, the way I see it is almost like, when you're on your phone and you're trying to locate somewhere on Google Maps or whatever. It's the difference between when you zoom in to look for a specific street or when you're looking for all the streets in the neighborhood. Like, you're trying to figure out, like, where can I make the right turn to get back on the highway or whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can go from higher resolution, which is, you zoom right in and you can see every street and every every street and every turn, and then you zoom all the way out, you have a broader view of this one thing you're looking for in your case, which is you're looking at all the Nigerian artists as opposed to zooming right into me and my house.
Yes, exactly. And the funny thing about it is it's like, okay, I'm trying to model the spirit of Nigerian artists. Now, now the thing is, like, how do I go about doing that? Well, one thing you can do is you can take the set of all Nigerian artists. So assume that the constraint data Nigerian artists is sufficient to point to a finite group of people on the planet. And so that is the surface of ignorance. It's all Nigerian artists are consistent with that data. And I'm trying to build the spirit of that thing. So
we have a huge basketball now. Imagine we have a huge basketball and each point is all Nigerian artists.
That's all Nigerian artists, exactly. And so what you can do, and this is what we do in statistical mechanics. So the paper I published is in the field quantum statistical mechanics. And one thing that you do is you create this thing called an ensemble. And so the ensemble would be, I'm going to take each individual Nigerian artist and I'm going to use all of their individual data to construct a model of Nigerian artists. So what you do is you can imagine that to construct the spirit of Nigerian artists, you have to ask, what type of art they create. How do they program the universe? Like, just make that simple. Like, use the definition of spirit. How do they program the universe? And how are they programmed by the universe? And so to do that, you create a bunch of experiments in which you put them in situations and you say, oh, they program the universe this way. Oh, they program the universe that way. And so what you do is you would sample the space of Nigerian artists. You would want to fairly sample all the space of Nigerian artists and just run them through the same experiment over and over. Oh, this one reacts this way, this one reacts that way, this one reacts that way. And then eventually what you do is you create some statistics on the likely outcome of what will happen if I place a Nigerian artist in this situation. I sampled all the Nigerian artists fairly, and now I've gotten this model of how they'll behave. And so that would be like that. And so you use the ensemble data, i.e. you use the information from each individual Nigerian artist to then construct a model of the spirit of Nigerian artists. Yeah. And so when you go through that process, like for example, when I was in grad school, there were a lot of Iranian students there. So I have a lot of friends from Iran, and the thing is like, what if I'm trying to build the model of Iranians, their culture, who they are, what type of people they are, what they do, what do they think, how do they act? And I'm trying to build that model. And so, I can't just know everything about the spirit of Iran, the entire country. But what I can do is I can take each individual Iranian I've met, and then I can look, okay, there seem to be some similarities about who they are, how they act, how they think. And then I can start getting an image of this spirit of Iranians. But the problem is that because I'm in grad school, I'm not sampling the space fairly. It's a biased sampling because I'm sampling the Iranians who go to grad school. Who are academics, who knew how to play the game to go from Iran to United States to become graduate students in physics. Like, that's a very specific group of people. And so to sample the spirit of Iran fairly, I would want to have a fair sample where I sample everything. But at the same time, by interacting with these few Iranians that I have some idea of the spirit of that country than I would otherwise.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is something we should apply, I guess, in our day-to-day lives as we, take stock of our environment and the people we meet and in our data gathering. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway is you have to treat that space like a maximally mixed state to where, you're not weighing one thing over the other. You are just observing. You're just acknowledging the information that you have, and you're making decisions based off of that information that you have. You're not making up your own information to satisfy whatever bias you already have.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. And it's funny because what you're just saying, you don't want to, create your bias, but the idea of the maximally mixed state or the maximally mixed distribution. When you're using that maximally mixed distribution to model something, then that's when you have pure freedom. So remember when we're talking about liberals and conservatives, and we're talking about about constraints. The whole point to putting the maximum mixed distribution, because you have no other information, is that there are no constraints. I mean, there are no constraints beyond the algebraic structure that generates relationships between all of the microstates, all the different ways that you can interpret cake.
Things.
There's a relationship between all those things. And so you have a constraint in that you have an algebraic structure that maps to all of them. But when you're trying to create a hierarchy of likelihood, and you're trying to put a distribution on that space, you pretty much have complete freedom to choose that. And that's your gauge freedom. You have freedom to choose the distribution, and which distribution you choose affects how you make decisions and affects your behavior. And so it's kind of interesting because you when you recognize that there's never absolute information, you realize that you are in this situation all the time.
All the time.
This is life. You are always in this situation. Yep. And how you decide to fix your gauge, how you choose to put the distribution on the set of possibilities. Like, do I always just assume that the person is racist every single time? Because that's going to affect my perception. It's going to affect how I interpret data. And you have to imagine that each way that you fix the gauge, every time you choose a distribution so that you make decisions based off what you think it is, given the information that you have to think that different ways of fixing the gauge corresponds to a different spirit, like a different structure inside of you, because you have to think of these spirits as they're taking in data and then they're spitting out interpretations. And then based on those interpretations, it affects how you program the world. It's like it affects how you're animated, how your system is animated, how it moves through the world, what states of being it embodies. It depends on like how do you fix gauge, because there's never full information. You always have to make decisions, and that's why life is so damn hard.
And I think just acknowledging that you don't have all the information and being aware enough to know how you're fixing the gauge, I think is key here, because like you said, you can't really have all the information. A perfect example, like I spoke about earlier, was going to the store with my hat on and then assuming that all the women were looking at me because they were like, oh, he's so
you were
cool.
feeling yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Versus, he just looks like, why does he have this wild looking hat on his head? And I'm pretty sure if I ran into like 20 women and they looked at me that way, being in a space where you can admit that, maybe one of them was looking at me like, oh, he was XYZ way. Maybe 5 of them were looking at me like, oh, I like the hat.
Yeah.
Being able to kind of navigate that space is the work.
Yes.
And we're doing this all the time with everything. You want to pick a certain kind of cereal off the aisle at the store. You want to decide what car to buy, your relationship, your job. You're trying to get a new job. We're constantly playing this game.
We're constantly playing the game. We're stuck in the world. And that's the whole point, is that the data structure, like when I look at my paper, like there's, and people can, if they want, they can Google it. So if you actually just type in surfaces of ignorance into Google, it should be like it should be the first thing that pops up.
It's but right when there. You by S. Ray, don't miss that.
Right there, man. That's
right there on the top. I saw that.
Yeah. So if you look at figure 10, it's on page 12 of the paper. There's this really elaborate looking, it looks like an arcade machine. Like I made it that way on purpose. Are you looking at it, Oyani?
Page what? What is this?
Page 12.
12. Hold on a second.
Yeah, we'll upload this on YouTube so that people can see the figure if they don't want to Google it. But 10, I remember
right? Page 10, right?
Page 12. Oh, is it page 10? It should be figure 10. Figure 10. All right. So do you remember when I sent that to you? I was really proud of making that.
Yeah.
So the thing about this structure, this thing right here. Remember in the Donald Hoffman video where he was talking about like we live in the data structure? Mm-hmm. This is what I imagine the data structure is. And I mean, I don't want to get into the full details of what I think why I view the data structure as this figure. But essentially what this paper does, like one of the things that's really important about it is when I'm doing my, like I call it canonical quantum coarse graining. And the reason why I call it that is because we are taking quantum states. And so quantum states, they live in these spaces called Hilbert spaces. And these Hilbert spaces, which Hilbert space you're in is determined by the symmetry group. So like the Lie groups, it's like this algebraic structure, the Lie groups, they determine the basically the algebraic structure of that Hilbert space that the quantum states live in. And so if you ever, like, there's one real popular quantum state that most people have ever heard of, it's called a qubit, a quantum bit. The symmetry group that represents that space is called SU2. So an SU2, the symmetry group, the Lie group SU2, the algebraic structure SU2, is a qubit. Like that's what a qubit is. It's SU2.
Okay.
And so when you're constructing these like say I have one particle and I'm trying to make a quantum model of it. I can take that one particle and I can try to describe its state in one of these Hilbert spaces. But say instead of having one particle, I have two particles. If I want to construct a space, like a Hilbert space that represents the quantum system that is the two particles, I have to construct something called a composite Hilbert space. So I literally take the two spaces and I multiply them together. And the way you multiply them is this process called a tensor product. So I take these two these two Hilbert spaces and I multiply them together. If it's a two-dimensional space and a two-dimensional space, I multiply them together, I have a four-dimensional space. And that four-dimensional space can model the system of two particles. And so in this paper that I'm trying to talk about is the way that I treat it is you have to assume, okay, this system has two particles, but say I only have access to one of the particles. Because I only have access to one of the particles, I'm missing the information contained in the other particle. And so what that does is you treat the information contained in the one particle as a lower resolution model of the two particle system. And so what that does is that when you are in the two-dimensional space, so I have one particle and I'm in the two-dimensional space, that one particle has some information in it, and I can compute the amount of information using the von Neumann entropy. Like, all right, this has so much information in it. And what that does is when I construct the set of purifications, which are the microstates, the constraint data is the information I have in the single particle. And that information, that single particle, that corresponds to a bunch of two particle systems. It could have come from, a bunch of two particle systems. And it's like the cake analogy. In this case, the quantum state is the cake. The single particle quantum state is the cake. Is the constraint cake. And then all the possible two particle systems that could have given me that one particle system, those are all the different ways of interpreting cake. Those are all the different, so that creates the surface of ignorance. Okay. And so what that means is that for every single particle system in the lower space, for all the single particle systems, there's a unique surface of ignorance associated with it. There's only one surface of ignorance associated with each state in the two-dimensional space.
Okay.
And so what that means is that you create a one-to-one relationship between a lower dimensional space and a higher dimensional space. You have the two-dimensional space, which is the information you have, and then you have the four-dimensional space, and I've created a one-to-one correspondence. Each point in the lower space has exactly one
corresponding point.
Surface of ignorance in the higher space, and these surfaces of ignorance don't overlap. And so now I've created an algebraic structure between a lower dimensional space and a higher dimensional space. And every time I add a new particle or I add a new Hilbert space, I can just keep doing this forever. So I can construct the relationship between all lower dimensional spaces and all larger dimensional spaces ad infinitum forever. Like it is a coarse-graining of all of composite Hilbert spaces you can construct. That's why I call it the canonical quantum coarse-graining. And to me, the importance of this, to bring this back into things that are a little more relatable if people have gone on that tangent with us, is when you're trying to conceptualize.
Okay.
Your capacity to conceptualize depends on the dimension of the space that you're conceptualizing in. And so, as we were saying in like the first or second episode, if you have, if I only have a language that has one bit, then I have up or down. If I have two bits, I have up, up, down, up, up, down, down, down. The more bits you have, the more computational capacity you have, the more relationships you can construct to conceptualize things like, what is reality? What am I? What are we? And so as the dimension of the space, or as I get more bits, as the dimension of that space grows, my capacity to conceptualize grows. And so what I'm trying to say is that when I'm thinking of these data structures, I'm thinking of how do I go. So say I have a language that is the lower dimensional language. This is the size of my language, but I want to go to a higher dimensional space to have a higher dimensional language so that I can conceptualize with more precision, with more resolution. Well, I need to be able to take the original language, preserve its structure, but then also add new structure to it in an algebraic way. And that's what this does. To add infinitum. So if you want to go to a higher state of understanding, at least in my opinion, you need to have a way of building a higher dimensional system, or a higher dimensional language, a higher dimensional metaphorical space that has the capacity to produce objective truth because it has a clear algebraic structure that tells you the relationships between everything. And then when I add a higher dimensional structure to it, I then feed it data. And then that new data structure is now is now my new understanding of reality. And then if I want to expand even higher, I have to create a higher dimensional space. And now that has a maximally mixed distribution on it. Then I feed that data, and now I have a structure. And then I go to a higher dimensional space, and now that has a maximally mixed. Yep. You do it ad infinitum.
Yeah,
that's what. And the reason why I like the quantum states is because, as we were saying, that classical information theory is applied probability theory, and quantum information theory is algebratized classical information theory. It's the algebra, it's the algebraic structure that is quantum mechanics. It's like what makes it, powerful.
Yeah. And I think, like we always say, it's algebra all the way down in the end.
Oh, it's algebra.
It's all the way down.
We're not going to get into it now, but that statement is algebra all the way down. I think that algebra is one of the deepest, most powerful conceptual tools that anyone can. It's one of the most powerful, algebra, because it tells you whether or not you've walked off the space.
It tells you.
it tells you.
And I appreciate that, a lot of times when you learn algebra in school, it almost seems like something like, oh, when am I ever going to use X, Y? But over time, I'm starting to see it more as a philosophical thing, like a way of thinking that you have to just learn.
Yes.
You just have to learn how to think in algebraic terms to make sense of things sometimes, because you're always trying to find the symmetries.
Yes.
And it will always guide you from falling off a cliff.
Because that statement you just said, or you're always trying to find the symmetries. Like, think about what we've been saying. You have some sort of information. You have some data. You feed it into your model, which is your language. And then that thing points in a direction. But it can't point absolutely. So there's always ignorance. So there's always a surface of ignorance. So what that surface of ignorance means that when I'm trying to fix the gauge, and I'm trying to make decisions, I have to work in that space. Yeah. But how do I know whether or not I'm working the space or not? Well, as long as I'm stepping from one point in the structure to another point in the structure, then I know that I've preserved the constraints, which means that I've satisfied the symmetries. And if you always have some means of verifying whether or not you're in that space, which is like what algebra allows you to do, then you can always know that you're following the symmetries and you haven't walked off a cliff.
Yeah. And my algebra teacher, back when I was younger, was you always have to find your way back. If you can't find your way back, you messed it up. So once you've solved this quadratic equation, or you've done some kind of simultaneous, whatever it is you've done in algebraic terms, when you find X and you find Y, it's always useful to go plug it back in and see, can I get back there?
Yes.
That's how I learned algebra when I was growing up. You always have to go plug it back in. Can I get back there? If you can't, then you've walked off a cliff.
Exactly what I was taught when I was in high school. It's like you solve the problem and you think you're done. It's like, nope, to finish the problem, you have to then take your solution and plug it back into the equation. And you have to look at something like you just brought up, the quadratic equation. Like, the quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And the whole point is that you have the freedom to choose A, B, and C. So if A is equal to this and B is equal to this and C is equal to that,
whatever you do, you have to get 0 when you're done.
Yeah, you have to, yeah. So now you have to find the x because it's x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. If you solve the equation, then the x that you have when you plug it back into the equation, it's going to say 0 equals 0. If it doesn't say 0 equals 0, you're screwed up.
Walked off a cliff. Yep.
And you have to understand that the x squared plus bx plus c, that is just equals 0. That is a constraint. It's a constraint that identifies a space. And whether or not you know that you're satisfying the constraints is whether or not I plug back in my value of x and get back 0. And if you look at the solution to the quadratic equation, it's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. That's the solution to the quadratic equation. And if you see it has that plus or minus, there are two solutions. Because it's a quadratic equation, it's x squared. So as I have x cubed and x fourth and x fifth, there are more and more solutions, and all of those solutions are the things that satisfy the constraint data. They are the different ways of interpreting cake. The equation is the word cake, and then all of the solutions to the equation cake are all of the microstates. They're all the things that satisfy the constraints. This is algebra.
It's algebra all the way down, guys. Sorry
to
disappoint.
and it's algebra all the way down in the sense that when you look at quantum mechanics and you're looking at quantum computing, it's all about unitary transformations. And you probably ask yourself, what is a unitary transformation? Well, it is an algebraic transformation. Unitary transformations are representations of the Lie groups of the algebra. They are the actual matrices, the actual matrix that takes in an input and maps to an output in an algebraic way. That's what unitary transformations are. And one thing that you can conceptualize the universe as is you can conceptualize the universe as a giant quantum state, as a giant pure quantum state. And so remember in Archetypes and Internal Spirits, where we're talking about all of the possible states of the universe, like there are the laws of physics. The laws of physics determine the set of configurations the universe that could be in that are valid. So the laws of physics are the constraint data. Yeah. And then all of the different states of the universe satisfy the constraint data. They're all microstates that satisfy the constraint data. And to go from one to the other, you're just doing these unitary transformations.
Yep.
You're just doing yeah.
I don't know, man. I think in the end, being able to look for the symmetries, I think that's probably maybe an episode we have to do.
Yeah. That'd probably be an episode.
Yeah, a good episode, because it really just helps kind of guide how I interpret information when I get it, because I'm always constantly trying to find, okay, this piece of information seems like it wants me to weigh this over this.
Yeah.
And you could see that in your everyday life, to where, you read a news article, it's like, they're trying to get me to place this much weight on this thing over this thing. So you have to know how to navigate that. And being able to find the symmetry is a good way, like, okay, you can't weigh this over this. This has to weigh equally to this, or you're just trying to trick me.
Exactly. And remember we said it in the first episode of the first season, when someone tries to pretend as though there's more information to say that it's definitely this interpretation for this one, they are lying to you. The objective state of the universe, the objective state is the surface of ignorance. That is reality. Yeah. And to your point, when you're saying follow the symmetries, like, you have to understand what we think we're doing in this podcast. The whole point to this podcast is to take words like spirit, art, all the words that we've been giving definitions for, and we want to create symbols for our language, because the whole point of this show is that we're trying to create a language. And so we're trying to create an algebraic structure, as we've already discussed in this episode. To create a language that can create meaning and truth is to create an algebraic structure so that it can produce meaning consistently. And so to do that, we are taking words that people know of, and then we're slightly changing them. Like the word spirit. Let's get rid of all the supernatural stuff. Let's get rid of that. The word art. Well, we have this structure of the conceptual space and the physical space. So bringing things from the conceptual space to the physical space, that is art. So we have these definitions that we're creating, and then we are trying to build the relationships between them by creating observations and noticing that there's symmetry. So if you go back to our episode, Follow the Symmetries, and I lay out exactly what we're doing. Here is a computer. Here is a human.
A human mind.
Here is a human. What are their symmetries? Okay, they are both physical subsets of the universe. And as physical subsets of the universe, they also can be placed in many different configurations based off the data they take in and how they process data. Those are the symmetries between minds and computer algorithms.
It's obvious.
It's obvious. And so given that symmetry, we can start to use our understanding of computers to have an understanding of what it means to be human. And so we link them together using nomentation without representation. It's a different configuration to be in the configuration of sad than it is to be in the configuration of happy. So each mental state has a physical state, this is how we're tying computers and humans together using nomentation without representation. And so anyone can verify these things, because if we tell you a secret, you can physically carry that secret, which means that we changed your state. So we've taken two words, we've given their definitions, we've identified the symmetries, and then we give an observation that anyone can verify to see that it is a symmetry. And then we're just going through and building a network of concepts and trying to make sure that we're always building the symmetries to build an algebraic structure. That is what we're doing.
Because that's the reason why it's so easy for us to link back to another episode or say, oh, did you? Yeah, it's because we are able to find our way back. So
Exactly. Exactly. And this is what, and the more a language doesn't have an algebraic structure, the more you have things like non-one-to-one mappings where you take in a word and it can map to a thing and the opposite
Especially
thing.
can map to the opposite thing.
To the opposite thing. If it maps to one thing and the opposite thing 50-50, then it has no meaning.
No, there's no data in there.
There's no information in there. Yeah. That's the whole point. And so whenever you look at people who are trying to elevate feelings as truth, it's like, okay, feelings are important. You have to be able to identify your feelings and then speak them truthfully. That's for sure. But we're not going to go around defining the definition of words based off of how you feel.
Based off of everybody's individual feelings, because, where's the objectivity there?
Where's the objectivity? You're just making chaos world and no one can communicate and no one lives in the same reality and no one has the same spirit and we're just screwed.
I agree. And this is probably something that we'll get into a little bit more probably in the second season, in the third season.
The third season, yeah.
But I think it's fun. I like that we're getting into more of these type of topics now. It's great.
It is great. Yeah, I think it's probably good to end the episode.
But yeah, I guess I'm gonna do the plugs, guys.
Yeah, do the plugs, yo.
Thanks for joining in and listening to us go on and on about these topics. We appreciate you guys more than Like always, you can always hit us up on the socials. We are on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at The Bottom Talk Podcast. We also have a Reddit page. You can send us a question or post something on there, or subscribe. It is The Bottom Turtle. That's the name of the Reddit page. And if you enjoy the podcast, remember to share with your friends. Recommend it, subscribe it, give us a like, leave some comments. We appreciate that. And we're hoping that we can grow the podcast with your help. And like always,
stay turtling, my friends.
See y'all later.
Peace.